There are moments in a person's life that arrive without warning, without ceremony, without any signal that everything is about to change. They don't announce themselves with thunder or bright light. They slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary days, dressed in grief and exhaustion, hiding beneath the weight of things that seem to be ending rather than beginning. For Lorena Vasquez, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, when her phone rang and the voice on the other end told her that her father was gone. She was standing in the break room of the dry cleaning shop where she worked, still wearing the plastic-coated apron she used when handling solvent, her hair pinned back and her feet already aching from 3 hours on the linoleum floor. The phone call lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time she walked back out to her station, the world looked exactly the same as it had before she picked up. The machines still hissed. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead. Her coworker still stood folding dress shirts in the corner, humming something under her breath. But Lorena knew, with the kind of quiet certainty that settles in the bones rather than the mind, that nothing would ever really be the same. Her father, Ernesto Vasquez, had been 74 years old. He had lived alone in the same house on the south side of the city for the last 11 years, ever since Lorena's mother passed. It was a modest house, the kind that neighborhoods like his produced in great numbers during a particular era, squat and square, with a concrete porch and aluminum window frames, and a yard that her father had always kept tidy, despite his aging body's protests. Ernesto had been a man of routine and little excess. He rose early, made his coffee strong, read the newspaper in the kitchen, and spent his afternoons either tending his small garden or sitting in the garage with his tools. He was not wealthy. He had never been wealthy. He worked most of his life in a manufacturing plant that made hydraulic components for industrial machinery, and when the plant closed and offered early retirement packages, he had taken his with quiet dignity and stretched it as far as it would go. Lorena had visited him every Sunday when she could manage it. It was not always possible. She had 2 children, a daughter named Sophia, who was 9, and a son named Marco, who had just turned 7, and she raised them on her own in a 2-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from her father's house. Their father had been absent for years, his presence reduced to a child support obligation he fulfilled inconsistently, and a phone call on birthdays that occasionally came a day late. Lorena did not dwell on that. She had learned long ago that dwelling on what was missing cost energy she could not afford to spend. She worked full-time at the dry cleaning shop and picked up weekend shifts at a grocery warehouse when the overtime was offered, and she managed. Not comfortably. Not without counting, without planning, without lying awake at night running numbers in her head. But she managed, and that had always been enough to keep moving forward. The funeral was held the following Friday. Lorena sat in the front pew with her children on either side of her and watched the faces of relatives she rarely saw file past the casket. Her brother Hector, older by 5 years, came with his wife and their teenage son. Her sister Marisol flew in from out of state with her husband, a man who wore a blazer to a funeral in October and kept checking his phone. There were cousins and neighbors, and a few of her father's old coworkers from the plant. Men in their 70s with stiff collars and hands that still looked like they belonged to younger, harder-working versions of themselves. The grief was real, but underneath it, almost from the first hour, something else began to surface. Something that Lorena had not anticipated, and that caught her off guard with its speed and its lack of shame. It started with the house. Hector brought it up at the small gathering after the service, while people were still standing in Lorena's father's kitchen with plates of food balanced in their hands. He mentioned it casually at first, the way people mention things they've already decided but want to appear to be only now considering. He said something about the house needing to be dealt with, that it wouldn't make sense to let it sit, that the property taxes would continue and somebody would have to handle the upkeep. His wife nodded as he spoke, and Lorena noticed the nod was too ready, too practiced. Marisol joined in within minutes. She said she'd already spoken with someone, a real estate contact of her husband's, who thought the house could sell quickly in the current market. She said it with the careful tone of someone delivering helpful information, but her eyes moved to Hector when she said it, a glance so brief most people would have missed it. Lorena did not miss it. She did not argue that day. She was too tired, and her children were sitting in the next room, and she understood that grief made people reach for the tangible, for things that could be acted on, settled, resolved. She understood it intellectually. She still felt the sting of it. In the weeks that followed, the calls came regularly. Hector called to discuss timelines. Marisol sent emails with links to estate sale companies and junk removal services. There were questions about the furniture, the appliances, the contents of the garage. Every conversation moved toward the same destination, toward clearing the house out and listing it, and splitting whatever remained of their father's modest estate 3 ways. Lorena did not object to the division. She had no particular claim to the house over her siblings, and she knew it. What bothered her was the speed of it, the efficiency of it, the way her father's life was being organized for dispersal before the ground above his grave had finished settling. She went to the house alone one Saturday morning in early November, before either of her siblings could arrange to come with her. She told herself she was going to check on things, to water the small plant her father kept on the kitchen windowsill, to make sure the heat was set low enough not to run up the bills. These things were true, but she was also going because she needed to be there alone, without the sound of Hector's voice calculating square footage or Marisol's husband offering unsolicited opinions about market timing. The house was cold when she let herself in. The smell of it hit her before anything else, coffee and motor oil, and the faint trace of the aftershave her father had used for as long as she could remember, the kind that came in a green bottle and cost almost nothing, and which she had never once thought about until now, when its absence pressed against her like a bruise. She moved through the room slowly. The kitchen was tidy, dishes stacked and dried the way her father always left them. The living room held his recliner, angled toward the television, a TV guide from 2 weeks earlier, on the side table beside it, a reading lamp positioned exactly where he would have needed it. His bedroom was made, the blanket tucked with the precision of a man who had made his bed every morning for 70 years, because that was simply what you did. Lorena stood in the doorway for a long time, not entering, just looking. The garage was where she spent most of the morning. It had been her father's true domain, the place where he was most himself. The walls were covered in pegboards, hung with tools arranged in outlines her father had drawn in marker, so he always knew where each one belonged. There were cans of oil and solvent on the shelves, labeled in his handwriting. There was an old workbench along one wall, its surface scarred with decades of use, and beneath it were metal drawers and wooden crates, and the accumulated evidence of a man who believed that nothing was truly broken until you had tried to fix it yourself. In the back corner of the garage, half hidden behind a standing toolbox and a stack of old paint cans, Lorena noticed something she had not remembered seeing before. It was a metal box, roughly the size of a small suitcase, though thicker and more solid in its construction. It appeared to be made of steel, though the surface was dull and mottled with age and what might have been years of garage dust. It had no visible label, no lock that she could immediately identify. It sat on the concrete floor with the settled stillness of something that had not been moved in a very long time. She crouched beside it. The metal was cold under her fingers. She tried to lift one edge and found it heavier than she had expected. Significantly heavier. Not the weight of an empty container, but the weight of something with contents that had substance and density. She pushed the toolbox aside to get a better look at it, and as she did, she noticed something she had missed at first glance. Along one edge of the box, so almost invisible beneath the accumulation of grime, was a thin seam. Not the seam of a lid, exactly, but something more deliberate, more precisely fitted, as though the box had been designed to look like a simple container while concealing a more complex interior structure. She did not open it that day. She was not sure why. Part of it was that she did not have the tools to try, and part of it was a feeling she could not immediately name, something between reverence and hesitation. The box had been in her father's garage for who knew how long, tucked behind his things out of sight. Whatever was inside, he had chosen to keep it here, in this corner, in this particular state of concealment. She felt that opening it deserved more than a rushed Saturday morning visit between school drop-off and the weekly grocery run. She took a photograph of it with her phone. Then she stood up, wiped the dust from her hands, and walked back through the house, making sure the windows were locked and the heat was set, and drove home to her children. The call from Hector came the following Monday. He had apparently arranged a time to go to the house himself because he mentioned the garage in a tone that told her he had already been through it. He spoke about clearing it out efficiently, about calling a removal service that would sort and haul away anything that didn't have clear value, about how it wasn't worth trying to sort through everything piece by piece. He used the word efficient 3 times in the space of 5 minutes. Then he mentioned the box. He described it as junk, his word, heavy junk, the kind of thing their father had collected throughout his life because he could never throw anything away. He said it looked like an old equipment case, probably from the plant, probably empty or full of hardware nobody needed. He said the removal service would take it along with everything else, and unless Lorena had a specific reason to hold on to it, there was no point letting sentimentality turn into a storage problem. Lorena held the phone against her ear and looked at the photograph she had taken. The box sat in the image exactly as she remembered it, heavy and quiet and peculiarly sealed. She told Hector she wanted to look through the garage herself before anything was removed. He sighed. Not dramatically, not rudely, but with the measured exhale of a man who had already calculated the timeline and didn't want it adjusted. He said fine. He supposed she could do that. But they really shouldn't let this drag on, because carrying 2 properties was expensive, and the longer the house sat empty, the more they were all losing money. He said it in a reasonable tone. That was the part that stayed with her after she hung up. How reasonable it all sounded. How the very reasonableness of it made her feel foolish for resisting, even though she could not have explained to anyone, herself included, exactly what it was she was resisting. She took the next Friday off work. It cost her the day's wages, which was money she did not easily absorb into her budget. She arranged for her neighbor to collect the children from school and give them an early dinner. She drove to her father's house in the late morning and went straight to the garage. The box was exactly where she had left it. She dragged it into the center of the garage floor with effort, breathing hard from the weight of it. Up close, in the thin November light coming through the single garage window, it looked even more deliberate in its construction than it had on her first visit. The steel was thick gauge, the kind used in industrial applications rather than household storage. The edges were chamfered, finished with precision, and that seam along one side, now that she was looking directly at it in better light, was clearly not incidental. It was a joint, a fitted junction between 2 separate sections of the box, held together by some mechanism she could not see from the outside. She ran her fingers along the seam slowly. There was no visible handle, no external latch. She pressed the sides and felt nothing give. She turned it carefully onto its face and examined the bottom, and it was there that she found it. Set flush into the base of the box, nearly invisible unless you were looking at the right angle in the right light, was a small recessed panel, roughly 3 inches square. Inside it was a keyhole so narrow it looked almost decorative, and beside it, a sequence of 4 small numbered wheels, of the kind found on combination locks from decades ago. their edges worn smooth with age. Lorena sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. Her father had owned a lockbox with a combination mechanism. He had kept it in the back corner of his garage, behind his tools, out of sight. He had never mentioned it. Not once in all the Sunday visits, in all the years she had known this garage like the back of her own hand. Had he ever pointed to this corner and said, "There is something here you should know about." She thought about who her father had been. Not the idea of him, not the grief-softened version that sat in her chest since the phone call in the break room, but the actual man. Ernesto Vasquez, who had worked in a factory for 31 years, who could fix anything mechanical, who had raised 3 children on a single income without complaint, who kept a vegetable garden and changed his own oil, and read the newspaper front to back every morning. A man of discipline and method, a man who did not do things without reason. He had not kept this box by accident. He had not left it unlocked. He had not placed it in a visible location. He had tucked it deliberately into a corner, behind other objects, out of casual sight. That meant something. That meant it was intended for concealment, at least in part. And concealment, Lorena knew from living long enough and watching people closely enough, was not always about shame. Sometimes it was about protection. Sometimes it was about waiting for the right moment that the person doing the concealing never quite arrived at. She spent the next hour in the garage, not trying to force the box open, but looking for something else. She went through her father's workbench methodically, opening every drawer, examining every shelf. She found what she was looking for in the 3rd drawer from the top, the one her father had always used for small hardware, like screws and washers, and bolts sorted into little plastic containers. At the back of the drawer, behind a container of machine screws, there was a small key. It was narrow, much shorter than a house key, with a simple bow and a single-cut blade. It was the kind of key that belonged to a lock so small it was almost decorative. Her hands were not entirely steady when she carried it to the box. The key fit. It turned with a resistance that felt like years of disuse, then yielded. She heard a click, small but unmistakable, like a latch releasing somewhere deep in the mechanism. But the box did not open. She looked at the combination wheels beside the keyhole and understood. The key was only part of it. The combination was the other half. She sat in the cold garage with the useless key in her hand and thought about her father. She thought about the numbers that had mattered to him. She thought about years and dates and sequences. She tried the year of her parents' wedding. She tried the year Lorena herself was born. She tried the year her mother died. None of them worked. She tried her father's own birth year, and the year he had retired, and the year the family had bought the house on this street. Nothing. She sat back and looked at the ceiling and let herself breathe. There was a particular kind of puzzle that a person's life becomes after they are gone. You think you knew them. You think the years of proximity and shared meals and Sunday visits add up to a complete picture. And then you find a locked box in the corner of their garage with a combination mechanism you cannot crack, and you realize that every person carries interior rooms you were never invited into. That was not a sad thought, necessarily. It was simply true. She covered the box with an old canvas tarp she found on the shelf, not to hide it, but to protect it from the dust and the drafts through the garage wall. She locked the garage, locked the house, and drove home. That night, after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down every number combination she could think of that might have meant something to her father. Dates, addresses, employee numbers, phone numbers from old family documents. She dug out of the box under her own bed, where she kept important papers. She wrote down the street address of the house where her father had grown up, which she knew from family stories, even if she had never seen the place. She wrote down the number of years her parents had been married. She wrote down her father's Army service number, which she found on a photocopy of his discharge papers that he had given her years ago for some bureaucratic reason she could no longer recall. The list grew to nearly 2 pages before she stopped. She looked at it for a while. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and went to bed. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the city outside her window and thought about the box. Not with the feverish excitement of someone who believed they were on the edge of something extraordinary, but with the quieter pull of someone who understood that an unanswered question, once noticed, does not simply go away on its own. She went back to the house the following Saturday. Hector had called twice more during the week to discuss the timeline for clearing the property, each call a little more pointed than the last. He had mentioned the box again, specifically, had said the removal service would weigh it, and if it was just old hardware, they'd take it for scrap, and she wouldn't even need to worry about it. He meant it as a reassurance. She accepted it as a warning. She worked through her list of combinations methodically. She tried each one twice, slowly, making sure the wheels were fully aligned before testing the latch again. Many of them produced nothing. A few she second-guessed and tried in reverse order. She was halfway through the list, kneeling on the cold concrete floor of the garage in the flat gray light of a November morning, when one of the combinations caused the mechanism to shift. It was not a dramatic sound. It was a soft, internal click, subtle enough that she thought for a moment she had imagined it. She pressed the edge of the recessed panel and felt resistance, then a slight give, as though something behind it had released. She pressed harder. The panel folded inward on a hinge she had not seen, and behind it, fitting snugly in a recessed track, was a second panel. This one had no keyhole and no combination wheels. It had only a shallow finger groove along its edge, the kind meant for gripping and sliding. Lorena knelt there in the cold and looked at the 2 open panels and the sliding surface beyond them, and understood, with a slow and spreading certainty, that whatever her father had put inside this box, he had not put there carelessly. She gripped the inner panel and slid it to the right. The box opened. Not fully, not like a simple lid. The mechanism was more complex than that, the kind of deliberate engineering that spoke of intention and foresight. The top of the box separated from the body along the seam she had noticed on her first visit, rising on internal hinges to reveal a second compartment nested within the outer shell. The space it revealed was lined with dense foam, the kind used to cushion precision instruments, cut into specific shapes that held their contents in place. And in those shapes, fitted with care, were objects she did not immediately understand. She leaned forward, her breath clouding in the cold air. The first thing she saw was an envelope, sealed and yellowed, with her name written on it in her father's handwriting. She did not open it immediately. She sat very still and looked at it, her name in those familiar letters, on her father's particular way of forming the capital L, the careful loop of the second A. She had seen that handwriting on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the note he used to put in her lunch bag when she was small. She had not expected to see it here. She had not expected it to hit her the way it did, like something physical, like a hand pressed gently against her sternum. She picked up the envelope with careful hands and turned it over. The back was sealed with a strip of tape that had dried and gone brittle with age. She set it on her knee and looked at the rest of the contents of the compartment. Beneath the envelope, fitted into the foam, were documents. Not loose papers, but bound packets held in plastic sleeves, the kind used for archival storage. She could see through the sleeves without opening them that the contents were dense with text and figures, columns of numbers and official stamps, and what appeared to be certificates of some kind. There were photographs as well, several of them, their edges visible above the tops of the sleeves. And beneath all of it, taking up the deepest section of the lined compartment, were objects she could not yet identify, wrapped tightly in cloth that had once been white, but had aged to the color of old paper. The garage was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The sound of the city continued exactly as it always had, indifferent and ordinary. Lorena Vasquez sat on the cold floor of her dead father's garage and held the sealed envelope with her name on it. And she understood that her father had left her something he had never found the words to explain in life. She was not sure she was ready to know what it was, but she also knew, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent her life managing things other people found too hard, too inconvenient, too overwhelming to deal with, that she was the only one who was going to do it. Not Hector with his timelines, not Marisol with her real estate contacts and her husband's opinions, not the removal service that would weigh the box and call it scrap and cart it away without a second thought. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was written on 3 pages of plain white paper in her father's handwriting. The letters smaller and more controlled than on the envelope. The kind of writing a person produces when they are choosing their words with great care and writing slowly enough to mean each one. The date at the top was from 4 years ago. He had written it 4 years before he died, and he had sealed it, and he had placed it inside the box, and he had locked the box and hidden the key in his workshop drawer, and he had never once said a word about any of it. She read the first line. "Mi hija, if you are reading this, then I did not find the courage to tell you myself, and for that I am sorry." She stopped. She pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. Then she breathed in, breathed out, and continued reading. What he had written in those 3 pages would take her weeks to fully absorb. Not because the words were difficult, but because the world they described was so far from the world she had always believed she understood, that her mind could only accept it in pieces, a little at a time, like something too large to see all at once. Her father had known things, he had done things, and he had kept it all hidden for reasons that the letter explained slowly and carefully, in the measured voice of a man who had thought about this for a long time and had finally decided, even if only on paper, to tell the truth. Her father's letter began the way her father himself had always approached difficult things, carefully, with context before confession, with explanation before revelation, as though he understood that the truth, delivered without preparation, could do damage that might never fully heal. He wrote that he had started the letter a dozen times over the years and stopped each time because he could never find the right moment, and because, if he was honest, he was afraid. Not of her reaction exactly, but of what the telling would require, of what it would mean to finally say out loud the things he had kept locked inside, the way he had kept the box locked in the corner of the garage, accessible in theory, untouched in practice. He wrote about his own father first, her grandfather, Ramon Vasquez, a man Lorena had known only through photographs and second-hand stories, since he had died before she was born. Ramon had come to this country as a young man with very little, the way many men of his generation and circumstance had come, carrying what he could and leaving behind what he couldn't take. He had worked in construction in the early years, then in a small machine shop, then eventually, through a combination of skill and relentless effort, in the precision instrument trade. He had a gift for mechanical things, an intuition for how parts related to one another, for tolerances and alignments, and the way pressure distributed itself through metal under stress. It was a gift he had passed to Lorena's father, who had passed some version of it to Lorena herself, though she had never had the circumstances to fully develop it. What the letter explained, slowly and with great care, was that Ramon Vasquez had not arrived in this country entirely without resources. He had brought something with him, not money exactly, not in any form that could be deposited in a bank or converted easily into the currency of daily life. He had brought valuables, tangible, physical, portable wealth of the kind that a man in uncertain circumstances, moving across borders and through unstable times, would choose over paper money or bank accounts that could be frozen, seized, or simply denied. Ernesto wrote that his father had never spoken of this openly. He had mentioned it once, near the end of his life, in a conversation that Ernesto had believed at the time to be the rambling of a sick old man. He had spoken of things he had brought with him, of the weight of the journey, of carrying something through a border crossing on a night when everything could have gone wrong, and somehow did not. He had said that he had put it somewhere safe, that it was for emergencies, so that there would come a day when it would be needed, and on that day, someone would need to know where to find it. Then he had drifted into sleep, and he had died 3 days later, and Ernesto had spent years believing the conversation had been nothing more than a dream or a delirium. But Ernesto had looked. That was what the letter revealed. He had looked quietly, methodically, the way he approached everything mechanical, working through the logic of where a man like his father would have hidden something, given the tools and the space and the habits he had known him to have. It had taken years, not continuous years, not obsessive searching, but a patient, periodic return to the question, fitting pieces together over decades the way other men fit puzzles on winter evenings. He had followed small threads, a notation in his father's papers, or a reference in a letter to a cousin that mentioned a weight, described in terms that seemed to be about more than a physical sensation, a name written in the margin of an old document that, when Ernesto eventually traced it, led him to a man who had been a broker of a particular kind of commodity in the years when his father had been active in the trade. What Ernesto had found, eventually, and what he had spent years verifying and understanding before he felt confident enough to document it, was that his own father had accumulated something extraordinary. Not through theft, the letter was careful about this, not through any means that would bring shame or legal consequence. Ramon Vasquez had been, in addition to everything else he appeared to be, a man with a precise and educated understanding of value, of the kind of value that persisted through instability, through currency collapses and political upheaval, and the 100 ways that ordinary wealth could evaporate in a single generation. He had understood that certain things held their worth regardless of what happened to the systems that humans built around them. And over a lifetime of careful, quiet accumulation, he had gathered those things, and he had hidden them, and he had died before he could fully explain what he had done. Lorena turned to the second page of the letter. Her father's handwriting remained steady throughout, though she could feel in the spacing of the words, in the way certain sentences ran longer than his usual style, the effort it was costing him to say all of this. He wrote that when he finally located what his father had left behind, he understood immediately why it had been hidden, not because it was shameful, but because it was large, because the scale of it was the kind of thing that changed the air around it, that altered how people saw you and what they thought they were owed and what they believed they had a right to claim. He had seen it happen in other families, the way unexpected wealth arrived and immediately became a source of conflict rather than comfort. He had watched neighbors and extended family members tear apart relationships over amounts that seemed significant, but were ultimately small compared to what he now held. He could not imagine what would happen if the full truth became known before the right structures were in place to protect it. So he had done what his father had done. He had kept it quiet. He had kept it safe. He had moved it once, onto a more secure location that he described in the letter in terms specific enough for someone who knew his world, the garage, the habits, the hiding places to follow. And he had built the box, not had it built, but built it himself over the course of several months, using his skills and his tools and his knowledge of how to create something that appeared to be one thing while being another. The foam lining, the double panel mechanism, the combination known only to him, using a sequence Lorena would recognize if she thought about it long enough, though he did not tell her what it was in the letter, only confirmed that she had clearly already found it, since she was reading this. That detail made her stop. He had known she would be the one. Not Hector, not Marisol. He had written the letter to her specifically, not had hidden the key in a drawer she would know to search, had chosen a combination that she would recognize. He had trusted her with this in a way he had never trusted either of her siblings, and he had never told her why, except for one sentence near the bottom of the second page that read simply, "Because you are the one who never stopped looking for ways forward, and the other two stopped trying a long time ago." She had to put the letter down for a minute after that. She pressed both hands flat on her knees and looked at the far wall of the garage, at the pegboard with her father's tools hanging in their outlines, and she breathed steadily until her vision was clear again. The third page of the letter was the most specific. It described what was inside the box in terms that were careful and measured, the way a man describes something he has spent years understanding and does not want to oversimplify. There were documents, her father wrote, certificates of ownership, authentication records, provenance chains going back decades. There were photographs documenting condition and chain of custody. And there were the items themselves, wrapped in cloth and nested in the foam, items that her grandfather had gathered and her father had preserved, and that now, through the locked box and the hidden key and the letter written in careful handwriting on 3 pages of plain white paper, belonged to her. He listed them. She read the list once, then read it again, more slowly. The words did not fully resolve into meaning on the first pass. They sat on the page like technical terms from a field she had not studied, not each one separately comprehensible, but collectively forming a picture too large to take in all at once. Coins, he had written. Specifically, a collection of gold coinage accumulated over decades by her grandfather during his years in the trade, representing multiple national mintings from the early and mid-20th century, authenticated and catalogued. Rare issue stamps, philatelic material of significant collector value, assembled during a period when her grandfather had been in correspondence with a dealer network that no longer existed in its original form. And then the item he had written about last, and with the most care, the item he had spent the most lines describing, the one that had required the most verification, and that he had gone to the most lengths to understand and document properly. Bearer bonds. The phrase sat on the page in her father's handwriting, and Lorena stared at it. She knew what bearer bonds were in the way a person knows the term for something they have read about in passing. A financial instrument, old-fashioned, largely discontinued in modern markets, the kind of bond whose ownership was determined not by a name in a registry, but simply by physical possession of the document itself. Whoever held the bond could redeem it. That was the nature of bearer bonds. They were, in essence, negotiable instruments that functioned almost like cash, except that they represented a specific face value that accumulated interest over time and could be redeemed through the issuing institution or through certain financial channels that her father had spent considerable effort identifying and documenting. And her grandfather had acquired them. Her father had listed the face values. He had listed the denominations. He had listed the accrued interest calculations he had worked out himself with painstaking care, based on the issuance dates and the interest rates applicable to each series, cross-referencing with financial records and legal documents he had obtained over years of quiet research. The total her father had written at the bottom of the third page, the figure he arrived at after accounting for the coins, the stamps, and the bonds at estimated current market values, was a number Lorena had to read 4 times before she believed her own eyes. $324 million. The garage was very still. The November air moved through the small gap at the bottom of the garage door, the way it always had. The tools hung on the pegboard the way they always had. The workbench stood against the far wall, the way it always had. Everything was exactly where it had always been, in the ordinary, familiar world of her father's garage, and Lorena Vasquez sat on the cold concrete floor in the middle of it and held a letter that said her grandfather had left behind a fortune that no one in the family had known about, that her father had spent decades quietly confirming and protecting, and that it now belonged to her. She did not cry. She did not laugh. She did not feel, in those first minutes, what she would have expected to feel if someone had described this scene to her in advance. She felt something quieter than any of those things, something that was less like emotion and more like the sensation of a long-held tension finally, and after years of constant invisible pressure, beginning to release. She sat there for a long time. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in its envelope and set it gently in her coat pocket, next to her phone and her keys and the grocery list she had been carrying around since Thursday and kept forgetting to use. She looked at the open box, the documents in their plastic sleeves, the photographs, the wrapped objects in the foam compartment, still unopened, still waiting. She did not unwrap them that day either, not because she was afraid, but because she understood, with a clarity that came from some place deeper than thought, that what happened next needed to be handled with great care. That this was not a moment for rushing, that her father had spent decades being patient with this, and she could afford to take a few days to think. She closed the box. She did not relock it. She covered it again with the canvas tarp. She sat in the garage for another half hour, thinking. Then she drove home and made dinner for her children, and watched them eat, and listened to Sophia describe a conflict between two girls in her class, with the intense seriousness of someone for whom fourth-grade social dynamics constitute genuine high stakes. She listened to Marco explain, at length and with great animation, why a particular video game character was superior to all other video game characters. She washed the dishes and helped them with their homework and put them to bed. And after the apartment was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about what her father had written. The first call she made the next morning was not to Hector. It was to a woman she had met 2 years earlier at a community event, a woman who worked in financial law and had given Lorena her card after a brief conversation about estate planning that Lorena had been too tired to fully follow at the time, but had felt instinctively was important. The card had been in the box under her bed with the other papers for all this time. The woman's name was Patricia Okafor. She was a senior associate at a firm that handled estates and asset management for high-net-worth clients, which Lorena had not been at the time she took the card, and was not now, but which she suspected she was about to become. Patricia answered on the third ring, and when Lorena said she had found something in her father's estate that she needed legal guidance on before she spoke to anyone else in her family, there was a pause on the other end of the line. The kind of professional pause that means the person you are calling has recognized the nature of what they are hearing. Patricia asked 3 questions. She asked whether Lorena had signed any documents regarding the estate disposition. She asked whether the items in question were in Lorena's physical possession or still at the property. She asked whether any other family members had been informed of the specific items. The answers were no. Still at the property, and no. Patricia said, "Don't move anything, don't sign anything, and come to my office on Thursday." Lorena went on Thursday. The office was in a building downtown that was not ostentatious, but was clearly serious, the kind of place where the carpets were thick and the reception desk was staffed by someone who smiled professionally and offered water without being asked. Lorena arrived in the same coat she wore to work and a blouse she saved for job interviews, and she carried the metal box, loaded into a large wheeled duffel bag she had borrowed from her neighbor, into a conference room where Patricia Okafor was waiting with a yellow legal pad and a colleague she introduced only as Robert, who specialized in asset authentication. Lorena placed the box on the table. She told them everything, when starting from the phone call in the dry cleaning shop break room and ending with the combination wheels and the foam-lined interior and the 3 pages of her father's handwriting. She took the letter from her coat pocket and laid it on the table. She spoke for nearly 45 minutes without interruption. When she finished, Patricia looked at Robert. Robert looked at the box. With Lorena's permission, he opened it. The examination that followed was methodical and careful. Robert handled each item with gloved hands, moving with the practiced precision of someone who spent their professional life assessing things other people had trouble assigning value to. He examined the documents first, spreading them carefully on the table, reading through the plastic sleeves before removing anything for closer inspection. He looked at the authentication certificates and the provenance records and the chain of custody documentation that Lorena's father had accumulated over decades with what appeared to be great personal effort. He looked for a long time at the photographs, holding some of them at different angles under the conference room light. Then he unwrapped the cloth-covered items from the foam compartment, one by one, and laid them on the velvet-lined tray he had brought with him in a black case. The gold coins were smaller than Lorena had imagined. She had pictured something cinematic, large, gleaming discs stacked dramatically. What emerged from the cloth wrappings were objects of considerable subtlety, each one a compressed history of a particular moment in economic and political time. Robert examined them through a loop he produced from his jacket pocket, turning each one slowly, checking edges and surfaces with the careful attention of someone reading a language written in metal. He did not speak while he worked. The room was very quiet. The stamps were in individual archival sleeves inside a flat case, fitted inside the deepest section of the foam. Robert opened the case and looked at the sleeves without removing them. Using a flat light source, he held at an angle to examine the condition of the paper and the integrity of the perforations. His expression remained neutral, but Lorena noticed the slight forward lean of his shoulders, the way his breathing slowed almost imperceptibly. These were signs she had learned to read in people who were trying not to show what they were feeling. The bearer bonds were last. They were in a sealed archival envelope within the document packets, protected by layers of acid-free paper that had kept them in a state of preservation that Robert said, when he finally spoke, was remarkable given how long they had been held. He laid them on the table in sequence, noting the issuance numbers, the denominations, the series identifiers. He cross-referenced them against a database on his laptop, entering information with quick, certain keystrokes, pausing occasionally to look at something more closely before typing again. He worked for 2.5 hours without stopping. Patricia sat across from Lorena during most of this and asked questions. Not about the items, but about the estate process so far, about what documents Lorena had or had not signed, and about what communications had passed between her and her siblings regarding the property. She made notes on the yellow legal pad in a small, even script that covered page after page. Her manner was calm and completely professional, but there was an attentiveness to it that felt personal. The attention of someone who understood that the woman sitting across from her had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just put it down on a table in a law office in downtown, and that what happened in this room over the next several hours was going to matter considerably. When Robert finally sat back and looked at them both, the quality of the silence in the room changed. It was the silence that follows the end of a very long piece of music, the kind of silence that has texture and weight. He said, "The documentation is among the most thorough private provenance records I have encountered outside of a major institution." He said this with the measured delivery of someone who does not give compliments carelessly. He said, "The coins represent an authenticated collection with a current auction market value that I would estimate conservatively at between $18 and $22 million, though certain pieces may command significantly higher individual figures, depending on the buyer pool. The stamps," he said, "are extraordinary. Several of the issues present in this collection are among the rarest surviving examples of their kind. Philatelic valuations at this level require specialist appraisal that I am not in a position to give with finality today, but based on what I can see, the collection would likely realize between $40 and $60 million at auction in current market conditions. He paused. He looked at the bonds on the table. He said, "I need to be transparent with you about the bearer bonds because their situation is more complex. Bearer bonds of this nature, issued in the periods represented here, have been the subject of significant legal and regulatory attention over the past several decades. The vast majority of instruments like these have been either redeemed, defaulted, or declared void. However, certain series, specifically those issued by institutions that remained solvent and maintained their redemption obligations through succession agreements, continue to carry legal redemption value. Several of the instruments here," he said, "appear to belong to that category. The face values, combined with the accumulated interest calculated from issuance dates, represent a significant sum. Verification of the specific redemption status will require engagement with the issuing institutions or their legal successors, a process that Patricia's firm is equipped to manage." He said, "Based on the issuance documentation and my initial assessment of their series identifiers, I believe your father's valuation was not unreasonable. The figure he arrived at may, in fact, be conservative." Lorena sat very still. Patricia said, "What Robert is telling you is that what you found in that box is real, and it is yours, and it is very large." She said it plainly, without drama, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis that is serious but treatable, giving the facts the respect of being stated without embellishment. She said, "What I need you to understand is that from this point forward, the way this is handled matters enormously. There are legal processes that will protect you and protect the assets. There are processes that, if not followed correctly, could complicate or delay your ability to access what your father left for you. My strong recommendation is that we move carefully and in the proper order, and that you do not discuss the specific details of what you found with your siblings or with anyone else until we have the legal framework in place that we need." Lorena looked at the objects on the table, the coins in their velvet rows, the stamp case with its archival sleeves, the bonds in their careful sequence, the box that had sat in the corner of her father's garage behind the standing toolbox and the stack of old paint cans, for years and years and years. She thought about the Tuesday morning in the dry cleaning shop, the plastic-coated apron, the fluorescent lights, the 2 minutes on the phone that had changed the shape of everything without yet revealing what the new shape would be. She thought about Hector's voice on the phone, efficient, certain, already knowing what would be done and in what order. She thought about Marisol's real estate contact and the assessment that the box was heavy junk, probably empty or full of hardware nobody needed. She thought about the removal service that would have waited by the pound. She thought about her father, who had known all of this for decades and had carried it alone, and who had chosen her. She said to Patricia, "Tell me what we need to do." The days that followed were unlike any period of her life that had come before them. Not because they were dramatic or loud. They were not. They were mostly quiet, administrative, procedurally dense in ways that she had not anticipated. There were documents to review, signatures to give on specific things in a specific order, authorizations to sign that allowed Patricia's firm to initiate contact with the relevant institutions on her behalf. There were secure transport arrangements for the physical items in the box, which were moved from the garage to a climate-controlled vault at a facility Patricia's firm used for exactly this kind of situation. The movement happened on a Tuesday morning, arranged and executed with a discretion that meant her neighbors saw nothing and her siblings were not informed. She went to work every day. She picked up her children from school. She made dinner and helped with homework, and lay awake at night running numbers in her head, the same way she always had, except now the numbers were different. The numbers were incomprehensibly different. But the habit of her life, the routine of managing and stretching and planning, continued as it had always continued, because she did not know how else to be, and because she understood, at some deep and private level, that who she was had been built by the years of managing and stretching and planning, and that was not something she wanted to set aside just because the arithmetic had changed. The authentication process for the bonds took 3 weeks. Patricia's firm worked with 2 financial institutions, both of which had successor relationships to the original issuing bodies. The process wasn't simple. It involved document examination, legal verification, correspondence with institutional archivists, and several conversations that Patricia reported to Lorena with careful summaries, keeping her informed without overwhelming her with technical detail. There were moments when it seemed that certain instruments might not clear verification. There were conversations in which the word complicated appeared more than once. Lorena held herself steady through all of it, keeping her face neutral in Patricia's office, driving home with her hand steady on the wheel, not allowing the uncertainty to show in front of her children. Then one afternoon, 6 weeks after the Thursday, when she had first sat down in that conference room, Patricia called. Lorena was in the break room of the dry cleaning shop. Same fluorescent lights. Same hiss of the machines from the floor. She pressed the phone against her ear and listened. Patricia's voice was composed, but Lorena heard beneath the composure something that was unmistakably satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that comes from a long process arriving at the right conclusion. The authentication was complete. The bonds were valid. The redemption process had been initiated with the relevant institutions and would proceed through established legal channels over the coming weeks. The coin collection had been formally appraised by a specialist house, and the valuation had come in at the upper end of Robert's initial estimate. The stamps had been evaluated by a philatelic expert retained specifically for this assessment, and 2 individual items in the collection had been identified as among the rarest surviving examples of their respective issues in the world. The total verified value, Patricia said, adjusting only slightly for the bond redemption timeline and accounting for the auction estimates on the physical items, was $318 million at minimum, with potential upside, depending on how certain of the rarest pieces performed at sale. She paused. She said, "Lorena, your father did not underestimate what he had. He understood exactly what it was worth." Lorena stood in the break room with the phone pressed against her ear, and the sound of the machines in the next room, and the smell of solvent in the air. And she thought of her father sitting in his garage with his tools arranged on the pegboard and his workbench scarred with decades of careful, competent work. She thought of him writing that letter on 3 pages of plain white paper and sealing it inside the box and trusting that she would find it. She thought of the line near the bottom of the 2nd page. "Because you are the one who never stopped looking for ways forward." She said, "Thank you, Patricia." She said it quietly because the break room was not private, and because even if it had been, she was not sure she had the voice for anything louder in that moment. She went back to the floor and finished her shift. There is a particular kind of restraint that only certain people are capable of. It is not the restraint of someone who lacks feeling. It is not the restraint of someone who does not understand the magnitude of what has happened to them. It is the restraint of someone who has been managing large and difficult things for long enough that they have learned, at a cellular level, that the way you handle a situation in its first hours often determines everything that follows. Lorena Vasquez had been practicing that kind of restraint her entire adult life. She had practiced it every time she opened a bill she could not immediately pay and set it down calmly and figured out the next step. She had practiced it every time her children needed something she was not sure she could provide, and she had looked at the problem without flinching and found a way. She had practiced it in the break room of a dry cleaning shop when a phone call told her her father was gone. And she practiced it now, in the weeks after Patricia's confirmation call, as the legal and financial machinery her attorney had set in motion continued its careful, deliberate work. She told no one. This was harder than it sounds. Not because she was tempted to boast, that impulse had never been part of her nature, but because secrecy has a weight to it when the thing you are keeping secret is enormous, and she was carrying it alone in the middle of her ordinary life, surrounded by people who knew nothing of what was happening beneath the surface. She drove the same route to work. She wore the same coat. She counted the same dollars at the end of the week and allocated them in the same order she always had. Rent first, then utilities, then groceries, then the children's school expenses, then whatever remained, which was never much. So she did this not because she had to, not anymore, but because the process of dismantling one life and building another could not happen in a single afternoon, and she had learned from years of managing fragile systems that the worst thing you could do was make large, irreversible moves before the new structure was fully ready to hold the weight. Patricia had been explicit about this. The bond redemption process operated on institutional timelines that could not be hurried. The auction consignments for the physical items required preparation, cataloging, and placement with the right houses to maximize the realized value. The legal documentation of the estate, particularly as it related to Lorena's standing as the sole intended beneficiary of the specific items her father had directed to her, now required careful handling to ensure that no subsequent claim from her siblings could be mounted with any reasonable chance of success. Patricia had explained this last point with the measured clarity of someone who had seen families do ugly things to each other when significant money appeared without warning, and who wanted her client to be protected before the money became visible. Lorena had signed what needed to be signed. She had reviewed what needed to be reviewed, sometimes sitting at her kitchen table until past midnight, with documents spread in front of her and a legal dictionary open on her phone, making sure she understood every line of every page before she added her signature. She had asked questions in Patricia's office that were careful and specific, and that had caused Robert, who sat in on several of the meetings, to look at her across the table with an expression she recognized as respect. She had done all of it without telling her children, without telling her neighbor, without telling the coworker at the dry cleaning shop who was the closest thing she had to a confidant. She told no one. Hector called twice during this period. The first call was about the estate timeline, the house, the question of when they were going to coordinate a clearing of the property. Lorena said she was still going through her father's things carefully and wasn't ready to commit to a date. Hector's pause on the other end of the line was brief but audible. He said he understood, but gently suggested that prolonged delays would create costs they were all sharing and that it would be practical to move forward soon. She said she appreciated the reminder and would be in touch. She kept her voice even and warm, the way you do when you know something the other person does not, and you are not yet ready to tell them. The second call was more pointed. Hector said he had stopped by the house to take some measurements, and he had noticed the garage had been partially reorganized, and that the large metal box that had been in the corner was no longer there. He asked if Lorena knew anything about that. She said she had moved some things around during one of her visits and had taken a few items for safekeeping. She said she would explain everything when the time was right. Another pause. He said, "Lorena, if there's something of value in that estate that belongs to all three of us, we need to be transparent about it." He said the word transparent with a careful emphasis that was meant to remind her of her obligations and which, instead, reminded her of the letter on the third page of her father's handwriting, the sentence about the other two having stopped trying a long time ago. She said she would be in touch. She said goodbye, and she set the phone down. Marisol called 3 days later, which told Lorena the two of them had been speaking. Marisol's approach was softer than Hector's, more indirect, which had always been Marisol's way. She said she was just checking in, just wanting to make sure Lorena was doing okay. The grief process was so different for everyone. She herself had been having a hard time. She said it in a tone that meant to establish emotional connection before moving to the actual subject. And the actual subject arrived approximately 4 minutes into the call, when Marisol mentioned that Hector had mentioned the box and that she was sure it was probably nothing, probably just old equipment like they'd thought. But just so they were all on the same page, had Lorena had a chance to look through it? Lorena said she was handling things with the help of an attorney who was assisting with the estate. She said it simply, without elaboration, and the quality of the silence on Marisol's end of the line changed immediately in a way that told Lorena her sister had understood the implications before she herself had finished processing them. An attorney, Marisol repeated. Yes, Lorena said, for the estate generally. Or, Lorena said, for my father's estate, yes. She said goodbye and ended the call. She knew that the next few weeks would be the hardest part of all of this. Not the legal complexity, not the institutional timelines, not the process of converting her grandfather's hidden lifetime of accumulated value into the kind of money that could be deposited, invested, and used. Those things were difficult, but manageable, with the right help, in the right order. The hardest part would be her siblings, because her siblings were not strangers. They were her family. They had grown up in the same house, sat at the same table, buried the same parents. Whatever their faults, whatever the calculations running behind Hector's efficient manner, or the careful indirection of Marisol's social intelligence, they were people she had known her entire life. And what was coming was going to change the shape of what they were to each other, and she could not fully know yet into what new shape it would settle. She thought about this often in those weeks. She thought about it honestly, without the comfort of imagining herself as purely righteous and them as purely calculating. She knew that the appearance of large money did something to people, something almost chemical, that bypassed their better selves before they even realized it was happening. She also knew that her father had made a choice, a deliberate and documented and legally supported choice, and that the choice had been made for reasons she understood and believed in, and that honoring it was not something she was willing to compromise on, regardless of what that cost in terms of family peace. Patricia filed the documentation that formally established the chain of custody and the specific directive of Ernesto Vasquez's intentions regarding the items in the metal box, approximately 8 weeks after Lorena had first walked into the conference room with the wheeled duffel bag. The filing was not aggressive, not accusatory. It simply established, through legal record, what had existed and what had been intended. It was a protection, Patricia said, a structure, the kind of thing that meant any challenge would have to contend with documented evidence rather than simply competing claims. 3 days after the filing, Hector called again. This time his voice carried a register she had not heard from him before, a tightness that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but contained elements of both. He said his own attorney had contacted him. He said he was having trouble understanding the situation. He said he thought the family should get together and talk about this in person before things went further. Lorena agreed to the meeting. It happened on a Saturday afternoon at Hector's house, which was larger than Lorena's apartment, in a way that had always been a quiet background fact of their relationship, unremarked, but present. Marisol drove up the night before and was already there when Lorena arrived. Hector's wife was in the kitchen and came out briefly to offer coffee, and then returned without pressing. The three of them sat in the living room, and for a moment nobody spoke, and Lorena recognized the particular silence of people who have spent time preparing what they want to say, and are all trying to determine who will begin. Hector began, He spoke carefully and at length. He said he wanted to understand what had been in the box. He said he was not trying to take anything from her. That was not the point. But they were all Papa's children, all three of them. And if there were significant assets in the estate, the right thing was to divide them the way they would have divided anything else. He said it with the conviction of someone who had rehearsed the argument and believed it was reasonable. And in its own narrow framework, it was reasonable. It made sense if you accepted the premise that all three of them had an equal claim. The letter in the envelope, the 3 pages of careful handwriting, the deliberate combination, and the hidden key, and the decades of patient, specific intention, all of that complicated the premise considerably. Lorena let him finish. Then she told them about the letter. She did not read it to them. She described it. She told them what their father had written about their grandfather, about the accumulation, about the years of quiet verification, about the box and the mechanism and the choice he had made about who to trust with it. She told them about the combination she had recognized, which was a sequence drawn from the address of the house where her grandfather had been born, a detail their father had mentioned to her once, years ago, in a conversation about the family's origins that she had apparently been the only one of the 3 of them to hold on to. She told them what her father had written about why he had chosen her. The room was very quiet when she finished. Marisol spoke first. Her voice was careful, measured. The voice of someone trying to find a position that acknowledged the emotional weight of what she had just heard without conceding the financial argument. She said she was sure Papa had meant well, that he had clearly trusted Lorena, that none of them doubted that. But she said that legal intentions expressed in an informal letter were not necessarily the same as a formal testamentary document, and that the family might want to think about what was fair before everything was finalized. Lorena said, he built that box with his own hands. He ground the combination mechanism. He wrote the letter 4 years before he died, and sealed it, and hid the key where only someone who knew his workshop would find it. She said, that is not an informal intention, so that is a man who spent decades making sure that what he had found would go to the right place. She did not say it with anger. She said it with the same steadiness she brought to everything, the steadiness of someone who had been carrying this for weeks now, and had already worked through the grief and the strangeness and the magnitude of it, and had arrived at a place of quiet clarity. Hector said, Lorena, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. She said, I know. He said, you can't seriously expect us to just accept that and walk away. She said, I expect you to respect what Papa wanted. The silence that followed was the longest of the afternoon. Outside the window, a car passed. A neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. The ordinary world continued exactly as it always had. Well, what happened next was not a single conversation, but a process that took several more weeks. There were calls between attorneys. There were documents exchanged. There were moments of tension that Lorena absorbed with the same patient steadiness she had brought to every hard thing in her life. Hector's attorney looked at the documentation and at the letter, and at the legal filing Patricia had prepared and delivered an assessment that Lorena was told about secondhand, an assessment that apparently used the phrase extremely well documented and the phrase legitimate testamentary intent in close proximity to each other in a way that told everyone involved what the realistic outcome of any challenge would be. There was no lawsuit. It was considered, she knew that, and she could read the direction of things in the tenor of the calls and in the formal language of the letters from Hector's attorney. But it was not filed. Whether that was because of the strength of the documentation or because, somewhere beneath the shock and the calculation, her brother and sister understood at some level that their father had known exactly what he was doing. She could not say for certain. Perhaps both things were true. What there was, eventually, was a conversation that was different from the first one. Quieter. Less prepared. Lorena and Hector alone on the phone one evening, the children already in bed, the apartment dark except for the lamp by the kitchen table. Hector said, "I want to understand why he didn't tell us. Not angrily, not strategically. Just asking." The voice of someone sitting with a thing that hurt. Lorena said, "I think he was afraid of what it would do to the family if everyone knew." She said, "I think he watched other people's families come apart over money, and he didn't want that to happen to us." She said, "I think he thought keeping it quiet was protecting us, even if it also meant carrying it alone." Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He should have trusted us more." Lorena said, "Maybe." She said, "But he trusted me the way he knew how to, and I'm not going to let that mean nothing." Another silence. Then Hector said, "I know." And she believed him. The money arrived in stages, the way large things arrive when the process is managed responsibly. The first physical items to be liquidated were the gold coins, placed with a specialist auction house that Patricia's firm had used before. I positioned in a sale that drew serious collector attention. The realized total, after the house's commission, was $21.4 million. The number appeared in Lorena's account statement in a way that still did not feel entirely real, though she had been preparing for it for weeks. The stamp collection followed approximately 2 months later. The 2 rarest individual items were placed in separate targeted sales, where the buyer pools were specifically cultivated, which Patricia had recommended, over a general auction to maximize the price. One of the 2 items, a particular stamp from a colonial-era printing, with fewer than a dozen known surviving examples in its specific condition grade, sold to a private collector through a specialist broker for $11 million on its own. The full collection realized $63 million in total, well above the initial estimate. The bond redemption process was the longest, extending over the better part of a year as each instrument was processed through its institutional channel. There were complications with 2 of the series, questions of successor liability and documentation requirements that required additional legal work, and, in one case, a formal arbitration proceeding that took 4 months to resolve. Patricia managed all of it with the tenacity and the particular kind of relentless professionalism that Lorena had come to understand was her specific and considerable gift. Every instrument was ultimately redeemed. Every one. The final accounting, it completed 14 months after the Thursday morning when Lorena had wheeled a duffel bag into a downtown conference room, was $326 million. The slight increase over her father's estimate was due to interest accrual on the bonds during the redemption period, which had continued to accumulate while the process ran its course. Her father had been almost exactly right. He had spent years doing his own calculations at a kitchen table or a garage workbench, cross-referencing documents and financial records with no professional assistance and no institutional access. And he had arrived at a figure within $2 million of the final realized total. She thought about that often. She thought about what it said about the kind of man he had been, the precision of him, the care. In the 14 months between the discovery and the final accounting, Lorena's life changed in ways that were both large and small, visible and invisible. Some of the visible changes came early. She left the dry cleaning shop 4 months in, not dramatically, not without notice, but with 2 weeks given and a quiet conversation with her manager, who had always been decent to her and who she thanked sincerely for the years. She moved herself and her children out of the 2-bedroom apartment and into a house, a real house with a yard, in a neighborhood with good schools and wide streets, and a kind of spatial generosity she had never had access to before. She made this move before the full accounting was complete, funded through an interim arrangement Patricia had structured, because she had looked at her daughter's face one evening when Sophia mentioned for the 3rd time that week that her bedroom was too small to have a friend sleep over, and she had thought, enough. Enough waiting. The structure is solid enough now. Move. Sophia got her own room. Marco got his. There was a yard with a tree in the back corner that had a branch at exactly the right height, and within 2 days of moving in, Marco had requested a rope and had spent an entire weekend afternoon swinging from it in the particular free and careless way of a 7-year-old boy who has not yet learned to be worried about falling. Lorena stood at the kitchen window and watched him and felt something move through her chest that was too large and too quiet for any word she could find for it. She enrolled Sophia in a school that had a strong arts program, but because Sophia had been drawing pictures of horses and cities and elaborate imaginary creatures since she was 4, and nobody had ever given her a proper place to develop it. She enrolled Marco in a program with a mathematics focus because Marco had a mind for patterns and numbers that his old school had not had the resources to cultivate. She did not do these things with fanfare. She simply did them, the way she had always done the necessary things, directly and without excess. She paid off debts that had been accumulating for years, the kind of low-level financial friction that never becomes a crisis, but never fully goes away either. The store credit card balance, the small personal loan she had taken when the car needed a transmission 2 years earlier, for the medical bill that had been sitting in the drawer since Marco's emergency room visit the previous winter. She paid them in a single afternoon, one after the other, methodically and without ceremony. And when she was done, she sat for a moment and felt the specific physical sensation of a weight that had been so constant she had stopped registering it as a weight, suddenly gone. She did not stop working. This surprised some people who heard about it later, though it did not surprise anyone who knew her well. She had spent months consulting with Patricia, and a financial advisor Patricia introduced her to, a careful and thoughtful man named Gerald, who specialized in wealth management for people who came to significant money without having grown up with it, and who understood the particular vulnerabilities and the particular strengths of that situation. Together, they built a structure, investments that were conservative and stable, trusts established for the children's futures that would fund their education and provide a foundation without replacing the necessary experience of building their own competence. A charitable foundation established in her grandfather's name because she had thought about Lorena Vasquez often during all of this, the young man who had crossed a border in the night, carrying things whose weight he understood better than most, and she wanted his name to mean something beyond the private accumulation that had been his primary legacy. The foundation she established focused on 2 areas. The first was vocational education and skilled trades training, because she had grown up watching her father's hands, the competence in them, the self-sufficiency they represented, and she believed there was a particular kind of dignity in work that required that kind of skill, and that the pathways to acquiring it needed to be more accessible than they currently were. The second area was emergency financial assistance for working families facing the kind of short-term crisis that without a small and immediate intervention could cascade into something much larger. She knew this territory personally. She knew what a single unexpected expense could do to a budget built with no margin, how it could start a chain reaction that took years to recover from. The foundation would not solve the systemic problems that created those situations, but it could interrupt specific cascades. It could buy time. She believed in buying time. She hired a director for the foundation, a woman with 20 years of nonprofit experience who asked the right questions in the interview and listened to the answers instead of waiting to speak. She established a board that included Gerald and Patricia and 2 community members she had met through her children's schools. She was present in the foundation's work without being controlling of it, which was the balance she had identified as most likely to produce lasting results. She also went back to school, part-time, sought evenings, in a program she had looked at years before and set aside because there was no time and no money. She enrolled in an engineering technology program at the community college, not because she needed the credentials, not now, but because she had always wanted to understand the things her hands already knew intuitively, wanted the language to go with the intuition. Her father's gift for mechanical things, for understanding how parts related to one another under stress, had passed to her, and she wanted to develop it in the way it deserved to be developed. She thought about her father constantly during the months that followed, not with the acute grief of the early weeks after his death, which had softened gradually into something more like a permanent, quiet presence, a voice in the back of her mind she could consult. She thought about what he had known and kept and carried. She thought about the decades he had spent maintaining a secret that had required constant vigilance and had given him nothing he could openly enjoy or share. She thought about whether he had been happy, and she believed he had been, in his particular quiet way, because his happiness had never been dependent on excess. It had been dependent on competence, on order, on the satisfaction of problems properly solved. He had kept the garden tidy. He had read the newspaper every morning. He had kept his tools in their outlined shapes on the pegboard. He had built a box with his own hands and hidden it in the corner and locked it and waited. She thought about what he had wanted for her. Not wealth exactly, she had come to believe. He had wanted her to have room. The thing that poverty most reliably denies is not comfort or pleasure or even security, though it denies those things too. It denies room. Room to make a mistake without it being catastrophic. Room to think about the future instead of only the present. Room to develop capabilities that require time and space, and the specific kind of attention that is only possible when you are not spending all your energy managing scarcity. He had wanted to give her room, and he had not known how to do it while he was alive, had been afraid of what the knowing would do to the family, and so he had found another way. She went to the cemetery on the anniversary of his death. She took the children. Sophia was 10 by then, old enough to understand in outline what had happened, though Lorena had told her only the essential facts, or told her that Grandpa had left them something important, that they were very lucky, that it was their responsibility to use it well. Marco was 8 and spent most of the cemetery visit examining a large beetle he found near the path, which Lorena decided was a perfectly valid way to be present. She brought flowers from the garden of the new house, which she had planted herself in the spring, the same kinds her father had grown, marigolds and salvia, and the small white flowers she did not know the name of, but which her father had always kept in the strip along the back fence. She stood at the grave for a long time after the children had drifted off to sit on a nearby bench. The stone was simple, the way her father had been simple, his name and his dates, and a single line she had chosen from the many she had considered and discarded. She had wanted something that was true without being sentimental, something that captured the particular quality of how he had moved through the world. She had chosen. He kept faith with what mattered. She stood with the flowers in her hands and the November air moving through the cemetery, and she thought about the locked box and the hidden key and the letter on 3 pages of plain white paper and the line near the bottom of the second page that she had memorized without intending to, and which had lived in her ever since. Because you are the one who never stopped looking for ways forward. She placed the flowers against the stone. She had not stopped. She had not stopped when the bills came faster than the money. And she had not stopped when the car needed the transmission, and the emergency room visit came in the same month, and the math simply did not work, and she had stayed up until 2 in the morning finding the way through anyway. She had not stopped when Hector said efficient, and Marisol sent links to removal services, and the box sat in the corner of the garage behind the standing toolbox, with its secret sealed inside, and nobody else saw any reason to look closer. She had looked closer. She had crouched down in the cold and brushed the dust away with her hand, and felt the weight of something that was not empty, and had understood, without anyone telling her, that weight was worth respecting. Her father had known that about her. He had known it before she had fully known it about herself. She said goodbye to him quietly, the way you say goodbye to someone who is not really gone because they are too thoroughly present in the way you think and move and make decisions. She said thank you in the way that is really more of an acknowledgement than a transaction, a recognition between two people, one living and one not, that something has been passed between them and received. Then she took her children's hands, one on each side, and they walked back through the cemetery toward the car, through the ordinary November light, and the world moved forward with them. There is a particular story that gets told about money. It goes like this. A person who has nothing finds something extraordinary, and the something extraordinary changes everything, and the life that was hard becomes easy, and the person who was dismissed becomes respected, and all the difficulty of before dissolves in the light of the after. It is a satisfying story. It is not quite a true one. What is true is this. The metal box was real. The letter was real. The bonds, the coins, the stamps, the archival sleeves and the foam lining, and the narrow key in the back of the third drawer, all of it was real. The $326 million was real. The house with the yard was real, and the tree with the rope was real, and Sophia's art program was real, and Marco's mathematics course was real. These things happened. What is also true is that Lorena Vasquez was already the person she needed to be before any of it happened. The patience was already there. The clarity was already there. The ability to look at a problem without flinching and find the way through and keep going was already there, built by years of having no choice but to develop it. The money did not make her. The money gave her room to be what she already was without the constant friction of scarcity. Her grandfather had crossed a border at night, carrying things whose value he understood. Her father had spent decades in a garage with his tools, carefully preserving and documenting what his father had left, building the box with his own hands, writing the letter in careful handwriting, trusting the right person with the key. Lorena had crouched in the cold and brushed the dust away and looked closer when everyone else was ready to call it junk and move on. 3 generations, 3 different kinds of work, one long, a patient act of faith that something kept with enough care would eventually find its way to the right hands at the right time. The metal box still exists. Lorena keeps it on a shelf in the room she uses as a study in the house with the yard. It is empty now. The foam lining has been removed. The combination mechanism has been disengaged. The inner panel slides freely without resistance. It sits on the shelf with no lock and no secret, open to anyone who cares to look inside. Her children know what it is. She has told them the whole story in the version appropriate to their ages, with more detail added as they grow older. She wants them to know where they come from, not from money, though the money is real and has changed what is possible for them, from something older and more durable than money, from the habit of paying attention, from the willingness to look at what others dismiss as worthless and ask, seriously and without embarrassment, whether that assessment is really true, from the understanding that locked things are not always locked to keep you out. Sometimes they are locked because what is inside requires the right person to open them. She tells her children, when you find something that seems heavier than it should be, that seems more deliberate than it appears, that seems to be waiting in a way that ordinary objects do not wait, don't walk past it. Crouch down. Brush the dust away. Feel what you find. Their grandfather taught her that, though he never said it in words. He said it in the way he arranged his tools on the pegboard, in the way he built the box with his own hands, and in the way he wrote 3 pages in careful handwriting and sealed them in an envelope, and trusted that one day, Someone who had learned to look closely at the things other people walked past would find it. She found it. And everything that followed was not luck. It was not fate. It was not a miracle dropped from the sky into the life of someone who happened to be standing in the right place. It was the meeting point of two kinds of preparation. The preparation of a man who spent decades keeping faith with what mattered, and the preparation of a woman who had spent her whole life learning never to stop looking for ways forward. When those two things met, in the cold of a November garage, beside a metal box half hidden behind a standing toolbox and a stack of old paint cans, everything that was always meant to be possible finally became possible. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. The auction house was nothing like she had imagined. She had pictured something formal and hushed, with wood paneling and men in suits sitting in rows raising small numbered paddles, with the restrained gestures of people who had been doing this long enough to make it look effortless. The reality was more modern and considerably more clinical. A bright room with clean walls and a digital display board above the podium. A hybrid sale that ran simultaneously in the room and through an online bidding platform that Patricia said now accounted for more than half of all serious collector transactions in this category. Lorena sat in the third row with Patricia beside her and watched the room fill with people who carried the particular ease of those who had always inhabited spaces like this one, who had grown up understanding that certain objects held concentrated value and that the acquisition of them was a legitimate and sophisticated pursuit. She had not planned to attend. Patricia had not suggested it was necessary, and Gerald had said the sale would proceed identically whether or not she was present. But she had wanted to be there. She had wanted to see it. She wanted to look at the room full of people who were about to bid on objects that her grandfather had gathered, one by one, across the decades of his working life, on objects he had wrapped in cloth and nested in foam and locked inside a box that had sat in the corner of a garage for years without anyone knowing what it contained. She wanted to be in the room when the world assigned a number to what he had done. The coins came up in two separate lots, a division Patricia's contact at the house had recommended to maximize competition between different buyer types. The first lot opened at a figure that already seemed large and climbed steadily. Each bid announced in a voice that carried no particular excitement, the way professionals in all fields develop the capacity to deliver extraordinary information in an ordinary tone. When the hammer came down on the second lot, the combined realized total was already past what Robert had called the conservative estimate. Lorena did not allow herself any visible reaction. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the numbers and thought about a man she had never met, her grandfather, who had understood from the beginning what these things were worth. The single stamp that sold for $11 million was handled by a different house, a specialist firm in a city 3 hours away that Patricia had insisted on for that specific item. Lorena did not attend that sale. She was at work. She found out the result through a text from Patricia that said simply, "Hammer at 11.2. She read it standing in the parking lot of the grocery warehouse where she was still picking up weekend shifts because she had not yet found the right moment to stop, because the routine of the work was something she was not quite ready to release, while the rest of her life was still in the process of becoming something new. She stood in the parking lot in the cold and read the text and thought, $11.2 million for a piece of paper smaller than a playing card, printed more than a century ago by people who could not possibly have imagined the chain of hands it would pass through before reaching this one. She went back inside and finished her shift. The first person outside of attorneys and financial advisors to whom she told the full story was her neighbor, the woman who had collected her children from school on the Friday she spent in the garage with the metal box. Her name was Delia, and she was 61 years old and had lived in the apartment next door for the entire time Lorena had lived there, and she had fed Lorena's children soup on 3 separate occasions when Lorena was too sick to cook, and she had never once made Lorena feel the weight of the favor. She was the kind of person whose friendship was so quietly reliable that it risked being taken for granted, and Lorena had been aware of this risk and had tried to be careful about it. She told Delia on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at Delia's kitchen table with coffee between them, the children in the next room watching something on television. She told her the whole story, beginning to end, the same way she had told it in Patricia's conference room, though with less legal precision and more of the texture of what it had actually felt like. The cold concrete of the garage floor, the weight of the envelope, the way the lock had clicked when the right combination finally aligned. Delia listened without interrupting. When Lorena finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father must have been a remarkable man." Lorena said, "He was ordinary in all the ways that matter most." Delia said, "Those are the most remarkable ones." She moved out of the apartment 4 months later, into the house with the yard. On the last day, after the movers had taken everything and the rooms were empty, she stood in the kitchen of the apartment that had been her children's first home and looked at the walls and the window and the particular angle of afternoon light she had lived with for years. She had been happy here, in the specific and qualified way that happiness arrives when you are managing a great deal and succeeding at it, when the margin is thin but holding. She wanted to remember that, not because she would ever want to return to it, but because she understood that what she had built in these rooms, the competence and the steadiness and the refusal to stop, was the foundation of everything that came after, and foundations deserved to be acknowledged. She locked the door for the last time and gave the key to the landlord and drove her children to the new house with the tree in the yard. The engineering technology program met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The classroom held 16 students of various ages and backgrounds, people who came to the material from different directions, some fresh from high school, and some returning after years in the workforce. A few like Lorena, who were there because they had always known this territory intuitively and wanted the formal understanding to go with the intuition. The instructor was a compact, precise man named Dr. Ferreira, who had spent 20 years in industrial applications before moving to teaching, and who ran the class with the kind of organized competence that reminded Lorena immediately of her father. On the first evening, Dr. Ferreira asked each student to describe something mechanical they had fixed or built with their own hands, something that had not worked, and then had worked because of their specific intervention. Lorena described the transmission on the car she had driven for 9 years, which she had learned to service herself after the second time it needed repair, and she had decided that paying a shop rate she could not comfortably afford for a job she could learn to do was a choice that did not make sense. She described it without embellishment, technically and specifically, and when she finished, Dr. Ferreira nodded once in a way that said she had described it correctly, and he had heard enough to know she belonged in the room. She sat in those classes twice a week and felt something in her mind, engaged, that had always been present, but had rarely been given this particular kind of attention. There was a satisfaction in the formal precision of it, in the language for things she had always done by feel, in the way the underlying principles revealed themselves as elegant once you had the framework to see them. She thought about her father. She thought about his hands on the combination mechanism of the box he had built, the precision with which he had cut the foam to hold the contents, the engineering of the double-panel lock that appeared to be one thing while being another. She understood now, in ways she had not fully had the language for before, the intelligence that had gone into that construction. It was not simple work. It was the work of someone who thought precisely about tolerances and mechanisms and the relationship between concealment and access. She took careful notes. She did well on the assessments. She was not the fastest student in the room, but she was the most methodical, which Dr. Ferreira seemed to regard as the more valuable quality. The foundation held its first grant cycle 8 months after its establishment. But Lorena sat in on the committee review process, not as a voting member, because she had decided deliberately to give the director and the board the authority to make those decisions without her presence distorting the dynamic, but as an observer, present to understand how the work was actually operating. 31 applications had been submitted for the Emergency Assistance Program. The committee reviewed each one with a thoroughness that she found both encouraging and sobering. Sobering because 31 families in crisis, documented in the careful and often painful language of people asking for help, was a number that made the size of the problem viscerally real in a way that statistics did not. 11 grants were awarded in the first cycle. Lorena read the summaries. A single mother with 2 children facing eviction after a medical leave had reduced her income below the threshold of her rent. A family of 4, where the primary earner had lost work after a back injury and whose savings had lasted 3 months before running out. A woman supporting her elderly mother and her own teenager on a home health aide wages, who had needed a car repair that cost more than she earned in 2 weeks and had no remaining credit to cover it. These were not dramatic stories. They were not the stories of catastrophic loss or extraordinary bad luck. They were the stories of ordinary margins, of systems built with no buffer, of the specific arithmetic of lives where every variable had to be exactly right and sometimes was not. Lorena knew this arithmetic. She had lived inside it for years. The foundation would not fix the conditions that produced it, but it could reach into specific moments of crisis and provide the small intervention that interrupted the cascade, and that was real, and it mattered. And she had the capacity to fund it for as long as she lived, and beyond that, if she built the endowment correctly, which she intended to do. She thought about her grandfather on the evening after the first grant cycle, sitting in the study with the empty box on the shelf above her. She thought about what he had carried across that border, the weight of it, the decision that it represented. He had understood that there were things worth preserving across instability, worth protecting through the kind of patience that outlasted circumstances. He had been thinking about the future in the most fundamental way possible, not about tomorrow or next year, but about what might be needed by people who did not yet exist, in conditions that could not yet be predicted. He had been right. She looked at the empty box on the shelf. The foam was gone, the mechanism disengaged, the panels sliding free. It held nothing now, in the literal sense. But she had come to understand that it held everything, in the sense that mattered. It held the record of what was possible when someone paid attention and kept faith and trusted that the right hands would eventually find the right key. She reached up and touched the edge of it, the way she had touched it the first time in the cold of the garage, and she thought, "Here we are, Papa. Here we are, Abuelo. Look at what your patience made possible." The light was on in Sophia's room across the hall. She could hear her daughter's voice, reading something aloud to herself the way she did when she was fully absorbed, the particular rhythm of a child who has found a book that has found her. From downstairs came the sound of Marco at the kitchen table, the repetitive soft tap of a pencil working through a problem. Stop and think and tap again. The sound of a mind that is not yet frustrated, that still finds the difficulty interesting. She stood in the study doorway and listened to her house. It sounded like enough. It sounded, in the most essential and unremarkable way, like exactly what it was. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.